I'll wait. Go ahead, Wayne.
All right, so I think it's my turn, Viet.
Yes, sir.
Thank you all for joining us today. This is an important event for what is a major new undertaking for HL7 by creating a new subdivision that will be supporting implementers to help put our standards, principally FHIR, to good use, to be able to make it easier for implementers to get tools to help them do things, to be able to try things out beyond the level of what we do in the current connectathons, not just trying out things as we try to exercise new features of the standard, but actually trying out things to help put things into production. So what we are doing today is we will be discussing a recent request for information and proposals. Is consciously doing both. We're really open to lots of new ideas, whatever may be suggested to help us build up the technological infrastructure that will perform capabilities like supporting connectathons that perhaps go around a year, putting up reference servers, increasing testing type capabilities. And really, if we see it as a evolutionary path of adding more and more things to help FHIR become more productively used as a global solution for interoperability. So we'll turn things back to Viet to give a presentation. And please save your questions. At that point of this meeting is to address some of your concerns and questions about proposing or responding to the RFIP. I believe we'll be having another webinar another week from now to give you a little more time to think through what you'd like to do. So Viet, back to you.
Thank you very much. And again, feel free as I'm going through the presentation to put your questions in the chat. I'd like to go ahead. There are only a few slides, so I'd like to cover the slides first, and then we can refer back to the slides if we have additional questions. So again, for those who have joined us just a little after we started, we are recording this presentation. So Diego, would you like to say anything as well before I jump in? Okay, I'll jump in. Just interrupt me if I miss anything. So
no, go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. I think for some folks who had reached out, mentioned that it was a little confusing to have an RFI, RFP, and hopefully with this presentation, you'll understand why we kind of use that combination. But really this, I'll just say RFI, and you'll know what I'm referring to, is really looking at the HL7, creating the standards implementation division to increase our support and really formalize our support of the FHIR implementation. And as part of the core services, along with a number of other services that are being defined, we are looking to have a FHIR ecosystem. And the notion of an ecosystem, and I'll expand more, is really to help advance our development of FHIR as a set of core technologies and standards, as well as the implementation guides that are being developed by a wider and wider group of implementers and stakeholders in the community. So we feel like this ecosystem is a very important aspect for us to advance FHIR and even increase more and more the adoption of FHIR more broadly in the healthcare ecosystem. As you may have heard, we have been working on, and I believe are soon to finalize the transfer of the Logica Sandbox over to HL7. And that Sandbox, for those who are unfamiliar, is a kind of turnkey approach to firing up or creating a FHIR server based on the happy open source FHIR implementation, and has a number of very useful components and features that the community has been using, and that it needed a long-term home to support its improvement and its governance and its support. So the Sandbox will really be the first component of this ecosystem, but we envision a number of additional components that I will lay out, and that all these components really are going to help us develop this high fidelity testing environment. When I say high fidelity, we look to go beyond the server to server or client to server testing that we've been doing today, to look at what does it look like to have a model of an entire ecosystem that represents what is a well-controlled environment of, but a representation of the broader ecosystem that has things like authorization, authentication, directories, and others. And we want to use standards there as well. And so this ecosystem will help be a reference implementation or a representation of those standards in working technology. So this RFI RFP was really looking to get feedback from the community as to the feasibility and utility of this, and how we can really make a service and a product that will enhance the value of HL7 to the broader community and further reinforce HL7's role as a health data interoperability leader. So there are a number of capabilities that we're envisioning. I don't have a huge architectural model for this. We have some started, but we didn't want to have folks' eyes glaze over. But really things that we're thinking about is the ability to have an ecosystem where implementers, well, we won't start with implementers. We'll start with even the standards developers, whether they be core FHIR standards developers or implementer communities such as the FHIR Accelerator or other groups that aren't quite accelerators, but have use cases and implementation guides they're working on. How can we use a testing ecosystem in conjunction with the work that's being done to develop the standards on the standard side of the house of HL7 in order for us to have well-tested implementation guides? So we want to be able to have the implementation guides manifested in technology as implementations and put in this ecosystem for testing like at Connectathons. But once those guides have been validated, reconciled, and published, or go to some milestone version, we would like a representation of that ecosystem so then we can test and allow the community to now test and develop their own technologies against those elements within an ecosystem. And that's really hard to do today because for the most part, every time we come to Connectathons or testing events, we are creating or trying to spin up a server with data and features, and that's very onerous and can be very challenging for new organizations getting into FHIR. So in order to do that, we need a set of architecture. We need a way to manage the architecture and manage the users. We need to be able to do provisioning of FHIR servers and be able to deploy them, much in the way we're doing with the logic of a sandbox, but even at a higher level and with a higher level of consistency and rigor and predictability. We want to be able to have servers that can be configured to represent different types of endpoints in the healthcare ecosystem, whether they be a provider EHR, an integrator, a payer, a public health organization, or a terminology endpoint. So we have a number of representations of the ecosystem that we want to have in the broader ecosystem within this ecosystem. So endpoint directories. We want to be able to have authorization and authentication. For the most part, a lot of what we do in Connectathons are using open endpoints, which are very important and very useful to testing. But in the real world, we often require authorization and authentication, and even getting up to speed for implementers on those aspects can be very challenging, whether you're a client to a server or server to server. We want to have, as I mentioned, terminology services, having the right terminology that supports implementation guides while having the flexibility of larger terminologies we can call upon to do our testing. On top of that, I'll even add things like supporting Smart on FHIR, CQL, and knowledge repositories. We'll need testing services. So I know the notion of testing has many definitions. We're really looking at conformance testing. Do the implementation guides provide the necessary artifacts like test scripts and others for organizations to test themselves against the implementation guides? The notion of certification, I think, is a higher bar, and we have organizations within HL7 membership and others that do that kind of testing, and it's certainly, in my opinion, a higher level of liability and even higher level of rigor, and has a level of complexity that is very specific to the specific implementation. So we're looking at that level of conformance testing around IGs to support testing of the IGs and specific implementer kind of development where they want to test in a neutral test sandbox. We want to have user management tools because not every user is going to need all the features of this ecosystem. They might just need to test a single application against some simple client or FHIR servers. But we also want to be able to have more advanced users that may be testing against multiple components of the ecosystem. We want to also be able to showcase applications and allow the folks using the ecosystem to showcase how they are able to test their technology in the ecosystem. And for me, that actually is great because it raises the bar for everyone. And in my opinion, allows a vendor who may be relatively new to the space, but may be developing really great technology based on FHIR to be able to say to a potential customer, I don't have a necessarily production implementation, but I have an implementation in this ecosystem that I can show you to show you that when I say my application works in FHIR, I can show you how that happens. And then importantly, we want to have this to be a self-sustaining endeavor while also making it as widely available as possible. So with that, what we ask for here is that think about these components and help us figure out what additional things that larger kind of categories of things we need to think about. And for each of these things, what in your experience and the industry's experience can we learn that we want to make sure that we put in and prioritize as additional kind of sub factors or sub functions within each of these categories. Oops. So with that, who's going to be using this ecosystem? We envision really a wide variety of stakeholders, whether they be stakeholders that work with end users like patients or a patient who wants to develop an application, but certainly the provider community and payer and public health and researchers that are already participating in the different FHIR accelerators or other projects and programs in the FHIR community. We want to be able to support the quality measure folks and what they're doing with FHIR. We want to be able to bring in more and more of the registry community. And then the important work that Gravity is doing and bringing the social services community into using more healthcare data and representing that data in FHIR. We need to figure out how we can help them work with a community that they might have been working at the human level or policy level, but not necessarily at this technical and data exchange level. From a technical standpoint, we want to be able to support individual developers who are interested in learning about FHIR and participating to the various levels of technology vendors, from small companies with fairly narrow offerings all the way to larger companies who want to both support and demonstrate their technologies. So that's going to be a wide range of technology we want to support. Of course, we want to have support and participation by the EHR vendors who have a large base of stakeholders who are both asking for FHIR technologies and want to develop their own. We want to work with the terminology vendors, whether they be the authorities or the vendors who provide services around terminologies. We talked about knowledge vendors, HIEs, and I'm just going to say everyone who has a willingness, a desire, and the capability to participate in a technical environment with working with FHIR. So with that, how do you take this information and how can you respond and help us? So there are components where I'll call it helping us figure out what we're missing. We've been vetting this idea with broad groups of people across the HL7 community and been trying to fill in the blanks, but I'm sure there are other blanks that we hadn't considered. So first of all, is this ecosystem feasible? And that might be an answer. It depends on how big you want it. So how big should it be? What are the major architectural components that we should include and that we're missing? For each of the ones that we've identified, or you may identify, what are the priority components that we would need to implement so that we can support this interoperability testing? And what would you think would be the level of effort for each of these kind of components so that we can realize this vision? And what we'd like to have it tomorrow, but how soon do we need to realize this entire vision, and what's a realistic timeline to realize it? And then what would you think would be an appropriate sustainability model for this so that it becomes a valued service and technology for the broader community while supporting the core standards work of HL7? And then with that, specifically, how can your organization help us? And so I put this in various different levels. One is, can you offer us some technical expertise? HL7 is very much member driven, and so our membership provides a lot of this technical expertise and standards development expertise. So would you be interested in participating in providing that expertise, whether it be architects, developers, and others? Would you be interested in an advisory group to help us with prioritization and strategy? Do you have technology, either open source or licensed technology that you'd be willing to donate or consider licensing? Would you consider being a sponsor, a founding sponsor of this ecosystem? We've had interest in that because folks want to demonstrate that they are committed to the advancement of FHIR, and their participation in HL7, the accelerators, and potentially in this ecosystem is a way that they are able to demonstrate this commitment. What are your thoughts about subscribing to this service once we have it up and running and at these different levels? And then if you have expertise, but you may be a small company and you want to participate, are there expertise that you could provide as contracted services, or things that I may not have considered here? So there's a wide range of ways to participate in the definition and elaboration and implementation and the use of this ecosystem. And we want to be able to have a great community that can help support it, develop it, and help it grow, and to support it in its sustainment. So with that, I think that is my last slide. I'm happy to go back in slides, but let's, I'll pause.
Can I talk first?
Oh, yeah, I was going to ask you, Diego, to comment, please.
You can see that as that we are crazy, and what the vision behind this is that 10 years ago or so, talking to the board, I told them that if your IG doesn't have any example, it's not worth the bytes that it has in our servers. And right now, if you see the QA part of the FHIR IG publisher, you will find out that it cares. It tells you, hey, you don't have any example here, or your examples are not valid. And I saw dozens of examples in the past that were not valid. I even created them. So the problem with examples is that they are not dynamic. And what we are creating is APIs. And the sheer nature of APIs is that they are dynamic. So I began maybe 2 years ago adding Postman collections to my IGs. And I realized that Postman collections are out of context. They are good. They are an improvement. If you see the examples and then you have the Postman collection, then the Postman collection is better than the examples, and the examples are better than nothing. But I think we are arriving to a level of maturity and having shared services that all our IGs will leverage. And I think that, I don't know who created the slide about the accelerator, but you have FHIR, and on top of that, you have US Core, and on top of that, you have the different, I think it was Viet because he's smiling. So the same should happen at the technology level. We should leverage whatever we created in the past and not reinvent it. And we can show that in our showcase. So if someone new enters and says, okay, how do we validate? How we use terminology? Everything is solved. It's this way. Don't reinvent it, please. But if we cannot show it and we are not able to leverage that, then we will never be able to show it. So that's what was my. What I want you is not to start running and say they are crazy, we are lost. No, we are trying to evolve from nothing to examples, to Postman collections, to one or many ecosystems. That's it.
Thank you, Diego. How about if you'd like to raise your hand in the participants? I think that is that a capability? I think we. Nope, I don't. I don't know if it's on this version. Dave, can folks raise their hand or? Okay, if you'd like to go ahead and raise your hand, we'll call folks one-on-one, and if you can keep your question as directed as possible, that would really help. So folks had, okay. So who would like to raise their hand first? Maybe well, before you, okay, go ahead. Gora?
Sure. From an RFP perspective, because it looks like since it's RFI and RFP, which means cost would be one question which will come up, and I presume there's no answer to that.
There's not a specific answer because we're trying to get a sense of scale and what is feasible to create in this ecosystem, the priorities. So we're trying to realign all those things together before we kind of hit the start button. Well, we already hit the start button with Logica, but how do we go to that next level? So to the extent that your organization or anyone here can help us get that sense of that scale, and then how you would like to participate and help us build this out, that's where we would say this is the first pass at this RFI, RFP, and how much it would cost. So that level of effort would be very helpful. I've gotten some kind of swag estimates that this would be around 3 Tiger teams or development teams of 10 people each. That doesn't have to be all contracted folks, but it would be enough that we would be able to build out the user interface, the architecture, the management layers.
So the suggestion may be you don't ask for in the RFP, don't ask for a financial bid, ask for a technical bid only at this stage.
Yes, that sounds great. Thank you. I think that's a great suggestion.
Yeah.
Okay. Mike Gould, did you have your hand up? Did Mike drop? Oh, I saw Mike just for a second. Okay.
Sorry, it took me a second to get off mute.
Oh, okay. There you go, Mike. Go ahead.
Thanks. So I put this into the chat, but the listserv that's associated with this, is that a project management listserv, or what's the appropriate way to find that on the HL7 site?
So the way this and other HL7 kind of contract work goes out is through I think, Dave, is it contract work?
It's contract listserv. It's called contracts. I think
Okay.
contracts at hl7.list.org.
Yeah, so if you wouldn't mind, Dave, typing whatever exactly that is in the chat, that folks.
Yep,
Yeah,
will do.
So we initially
I
put that out.
found it too, so thank you.
Yeah, we initially put it out to that because that's the process that was defined, but then we realized that we wanted even a broader, and so we put it. I think Dave put it out on Zulip and other places, and so that's why we want to allow folks the opportunity to respond. So let's see, other question. As part of the ask for a vendor to host the Logica platform, and if so, the architectural details around it available. So at the moment, HL7's hosting will be, well, it's being hosted still Logica, and it will be transferred over. So one of the opportunities, and we've had and appreciate support of AWS as a cloud vendor in hosting services. So that can be an offering if that is a possibility. So yes. Other questions? Again, feel free to raise your hand.
And I put that contract listserv information in the chat, as well as a link to where you can sign up for that contract listserv on hl7.org. And for those who don't know where to raise the hand, look for the reactions icon in the Zoom toolbar. If you don't see it, it might be under the more icon with 3 dots.
I thought honestly we'd have an hour of questions. I can't be that clear. Johnny Bender?
Hey there, how are you doing? This is Johnny Bender from ONC. I just wanted to say that this is really exciting and cool that y'all are collecting this information. from the community. I'm on the tools and testing branch at ONC. We obviously do a lot of testing and frequently see a lot of the gaps in tooling that exist. And we, from the historically from the Inferno community perspective, we've gotten a lot of questions on features that can be added to Inferno and stuff, and whether tooling exists for things out there. We've also done some piloting work with a class of students at Georgia Tech through their Master's in Computer Science program, and have worked with implementation guides there, including some analysis of implementation guides, and realized that there's a lot of gaps in implementation guides, or at least a lot of differences between implementation guides. And so I think any tooling that would help implementation guide developers create implementation guides that can actually be computable, and marrying IG development with testing and considering testing at the time of IG development, I think is all going to be great. And I think this yeah, I don't know. I think this is just very timely. Obviously, signals your how much you believe testing is important for implementation guide development, and then also for implementation. So highly support this. Yeah, and we'll try and provide all the insights that we've had over the years for this as well. So thanks again.
Thank you very much. And just as a couple comments around that, these ideas we've been socializing for, I'll say about a year, mainly because we recognized that the FAST work was very much maturing, and that the guidance that the FAST Tiger teams were developing, and as they're moving into HL7, were becoming more solidified. And that we were then also in DaVinci. For those who don't know me, I help support DaVinci, and we were looking at how do we do larger scale piloting. And so we think that this ecosystem can support those stages of piloting and proving out many of the things that, or guides, hopefully, that the FAST groups will create and put through HL7. So we want to have that manifestation of directories and versioning and testing and authorization authentication as representations within this ecosystem. So thank you for that support. And we would like to look at the work that ONC has sponsored, and much of which has been created with MITRE to bring some of those open source technologies into the ecosystem as additional features. I do get questions sometimes like, are we going to be competing with our members? And in my mind, we're not. I think right now, this is a way for HL7 to really blaze a trail or reinforce the importance that we put on implementation and good and rigorous implementation, and that if others start to duplicate that and provide additional services to commercial entities, we think that's great, because that's only going to make FHIR better implemented, more widely implemented, and again, support HL7. Kathleen, you had a question?
Well, I had a sort of a comment.
Sure.
I really love this, but one of the things I'm thinking is that once this was in place, there would be people who would come and want to use it who might need use case specific guidance. And the reason I'm thinking of this is a co-chair of financial management and security. There are, we work with the accelerators, and they often come with requests for help, which we are, willing to do, but we only have so much bandwidth. Mm-hmm. And if this were in place, it would seem to me to having a group of members of HL7 who have passed some kind of certification that they know how to use this, plus they are knowledgeable about standards development, could be available to communities who come, so they don't have to fish around. So we are co-chairs going, oh my God, I don't have the bandwidth to do this, but I want to. Just to sort of set up a directory of folks who are known to be able to walk people through this new environment.
Yes, I think I agree with you that we have many folks who are just coming into HL7, a lot of subject matter experts who know what they need, but aren't the as technically savvy. So addition to the having the ecosystem and the management of the ecosystem will need education, and we'll need some combination of support of organizations and individuals and accelerators utilizing the ecosystem. I could envision members who are trained and authorized to do that, but I would also envision that HL7 providing that through the standards implementation division. That fits very well in my mind as a capability. And sorry, my automatic lights turning off here. So I agree with you that as part of the not only the technical support, we need to be able to provide the professional kind of services support. Diego, do you have a comment? Or would you like to address Lloyd's question?
I wanted to address Lloyd's question. I think, is the expectation that all will be supported eventually? Maybe not this year. I would like to, because if not, your IG will be in disadvantage compared with the others. So I would like that to happen. I'm not sure what is the criteria for what gets included when. Everything should be included.
Yes, I think we
because and the other question about the support for affiliate IGs, I think we are all the same. The only thing I have doubts about is I would love to use fast infrastructure. I'm not sure if I can, because maybe in some other countries, the ecosystem for Argentina, maybe it's using a different authorization server or whatever, but I would love to use the platform for the ecosystem to build my own ecosystem. I don't know if you understand. So maybe it's not one ecosystem, maybe it's a different set of ecosystem depending on your needs and your underlying infrastructure, but everything should follow the same rules.
Yeah, so actually, that's a great point, Diego, and you pointed out to me in our earlier discussions. We think that this could be a great model for other countries who are looking to mature their healthcare ecosystem and want some example. We don't talk about it particularly for this ecosystem, but I love that Diego gave me a great term from spec to wire. And so how do we help the broader community learn the best practices, not only for our implementation guys, but implementing FHIR? And what I would say to Lloyd's comment is, yes, we would like to have them all, but it's a chicken and egg problem. And in my mind and in conversations with the Focus Envisioning group, is that we need to increase the rigor and the maturity of our implementation guides so that they have the artifacts, as Diego mentioned, in order for an implementer to more rigorously test their implementations. They have to have the use cases, they have to have the sample data. And as we mature those guides, then handing it over to the implementation division to make it real, or taking, like Da Vinci has done, reference implementations and making them more, have a higher fidelity. That's how
I want to do another comment. I have this problem already, and we are creating our own sandbox and ecosystem for testing for our own IGs. And maybe some other affiliates or countries are doing the same. And maybe we are doing a redundant effort if we can get together and do it right. Because I'm sure that HL7 International will do it better than we are doing it. So, and they will take into account a lot of things that we are not. And mostly because you are here too, Lloyd. So I know that it can be done better than we have done it independently. And I think we all deserve to use this. There's a problem of who can pay for it, but that's a different issue. And I will not forget, it's not only countries, it's also a lot of big organizations like WHO and PAHO are beginning to are creating implementation guides, and they are doing the same. And they are doing some IGs that have examples, but not sure that they can be used. Maybe they're young yet as an IG. but I think we all deserve better implementation support. And I think all of us deserve it, maybe not all of it at the same time. Let's think about it.
So I'd like to respond to Hugh's question. Many IGs are in the context of an EHR or other major system. Does the ecosystem provide a basic EHR, for instance, to provide an appropriate context? I'd like to actually, this is a great question. At the most basic level, I would envision that we would have FHIR servers that you could, you would have the basic, say, happy features. But we recognize that there are probably functionality that EHRs have that might get exposed as FHIR, and that it's not as easy to represent that in the operations. So sometimes when we do operations and we do testing, we black box all the processing that might be done from an EHR perspective. And we only provide the inputs and what we expect the outputs to do, but we know that we got to build the black box, or the implementers have to build the black box. So one thought might be, and I'd like to get the recommendations from the community, how could we better represent some of these endpoints that we want to do complex operations? Do we want to take an open source or ask an open source EHR to do it, or to support it? Or one thing we had envisioned is all the major EHRs have their own developer sandboxes that have a bunch of features available to them. Is there a way for us to provide secure access and make kind of tunnels to those other developer sandboxes, so we can be a sandbox of sandboxes? And so the EHR vendors can provide a way to work with their sandboxes within this ecosystem. And so that's kind of feedback I'd like to get from those EHR vendors as well. So we know that we can create things at the FHIR interoperability level, but when it goes to real world, there are limitations that happen when you implement it. Yes, Preston, yes, some of the common requests we have from the Logica Sandbox is a pluggable EHR backend for development. And I would love to figure out how we can do that. One thought we had is if you can take the EHR's capability statement and represent that as a kind of server, even though it's not, you may not have all the backend, but you might have be able to constrain down the functionality of an EHR. So next question, Mario. You have to go on mute, off mute.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes.
So I was going to ask.
Oh, you went back on mute. All right, you're back on mute. Oh. Mario.
All right, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Is there any? Are you guys getting any feedback?
Nope, not that I can.
So with respect to testing, one of the things we often get asked is context-aware testing, where the EHR systems are aware of the various state of the patient record, and as you advance through workflow-related testing, so do you anticipate in these ecosystems to do context-aware testing, where you're going to look to dynamically control the patient's state to be able to test those types of workflows?
I would say I 100% agree that we need to be able to do that, but that is beyond my grade as informaticist to do that in that server. And how do we represent workflow, and how we can represent sample data. So I would love to feedback on how we could do that, so that we can support state changes in data, because we don't often do that in our testing.
Right. So the follow-up question would be, you may not be able to get as accurate an answer through an RFP, RFI response by November 30th. Are you considering having a one-year bake-off where people can bring their technologies, demonstrate to the larger community, get feedback, show their velocity, show what they can do in order to make a final decision, because you may need time with these technologies to see what is capable. Like looking at a single response coming in on November 30th may be difficult to assess what people are really able to do in a 365-day, 7 days a week environment.
I agree with you. And I think the idea of bake-off makes a lot of sense. I also realize that this isn't going to be manifested in one iteration. So we want to look at how could we make this ecosystem real, and starting with what we have with the Sandbox, and then advancing from there. So I'm certainly personally open to the idea of doing those bake-offs and then figuring out how they would work. So thank you. Question from Rob. That brings up the question of how distributed the entire ecosystem will be. Is the concept that the ecosystem contains everything, or will there be ability for various components to be distributed and hosted externally? I think I conceptually like that idea. And that's what I was thinking about when I was saying, you have one of the all the EHR vendors being able to connect their sandboxes somehow to the ecosystem, so that implementers could utilize that to show how their workflows work. One idea that we've talked about is, if we have all these different cloud vendors who have FHIR offerings, it's great, and they would love that everyone uses their offering, but each one may have different capabilities and components, and certainly the customers of a given cloud vendor will likely need to work with other stakeholders or business associates who use a different vendor. So is there an opportunity for us to utilize the ecosystem to help folks learn how one manifestation or of FHIR in one cloud vendor can work harmoniously with another vendor? Because it may not be just purely use FHIR. There's probably layers of complexity that if we can collectively gather that knowledge, we could help the community, or you could help learn how you can help your customers. Yes, Preston points out, we have this Logica Sandbox has the launch scenario that is really helpful, because it allows you to have a starting point with payer, or not a payer, a user, a provider, a patient, and an app in order to do demonstrations. So I envision we either reuse or recreate much of the functionality in the Sandbox, because it's been tried and true and has been found to be very useful. Comments from Wayne, Diego, others?
There is another question before that. And
Sorry. Yes, so that use case.
What is the concept for setting up and configuring the ecosystem support by use case?
Yeah,
I think it's a combination of both, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, those are things we want to be able to do. So I can name off things that I've seen done and I think would be great for this ecosystem. So this is a good example where things that you could put in RFI if you have an understanding of capabilities, or you think a functionality should be included. But certainly the idea here is that if you had a Vulkan, a Da Vinci, a gravity use case you want to test, you need that data. In order to test it at that level, you need the FHIR resources, and you need to be able to represent the actors in a given scenario, and then either elaborate that scenario or reuse that scenario or add scenarios. And I think that's all the benefit of that is to really test the IGs and to help the industry understand how we can use the IGs to improve care, reporting, or other processes in healthcare. Other questions? So Dave and Wayne, what would be the best way for folks to submit additional questions if they have them regarding this?
Well, typically they come to me. Now, granted, I can answer very few of them, especially if they're technical. But yes, that is.
Well, he'll forward it to the three of us. So I think it was the PMO at HL7.org. Dave.
Yes.
That the email is, that's what's in the RFIP. So there's an email link there. Dave, maybe you can put it in the chat and send those in. We did have thoughts of having a second webinar in another week. if people have more questions at that point, but we'll see about that. Do you still want to proceed with that yet? Do you think that's still necessary?
I think so, because we did this first layer of answering questions. Maybe folks on the call, I mean, if you want to use the reaction, maybe there's a thumbs up reaction, and let us know if you think you'd like another opportunity to ask additional questions once you've had a chance to churn and socialize this within your organizations. They get a thumbs up. At least a couple. So yeah, I think the short notice may have resulted in fewer folks today than might come to another one. So I think it'd probably be good. Diego, would you agree?
Yes, completely.
Okay, then same day, same time, a week from today.
And there will be a recording available of this?
Yes. So next week's will have a different Zoom link to join.
Great. So last call for any additional questions.
Rob has asked another question. Do you envision the Logica sandboxes being more customizable going forward? For instance, can define new operations? Will the sandbox provide the functionality to implement operations to support those types of customizations?
Yeah.
I hope so.
Yes, I would hope so too. And it's a couple of different questions when you ask that. One is the perspective of the current Logica Sandbox is based very much on the HAPI and the HAPI releases, which is a version of FHIR that really supports the entire international community. Whereas there are, and so we can certainly keep up with that, which are core FHIR operations and resources, versus what we look at using those operations and data for particular IGs. So it may be that those reference implementations for a given IG, I would think would be some combination of support from the implementation division, but also the group that created the IG, because they know how it's supposed to function. So I think we would want to support the most current version of HAPI, so that we can also address what Hugh mentioned, like the R5 version that's soon to go to ballot. So multiple versions, as much representation of FHIR functionality as we possibly can, both in core and in the additional that are identified in implementation guides. So Gora, question?
Yeah, just a comment. One thing you didn't have, maybe it would be good to add to the capabilities, is educational aspect of it.
Yes, and I didn't put it in here mainly because that is one of the core processes we envision for the standards implementation division. Technical education, collaboration with the standards side of the house to do education about the standards, and then technical implementation type education for the community. And we do, yes, we plan to continue to support the Logica Sandbox during this entire transition. All right. Well, with, I think I've gotten everything. So
Preston wants to talk.
Yes, Preston.
Hey, thanks. Yeah, on that last question. So the support, though, any tickets that are filed with Logica during this time are actually getting automatically assigned to Michael Dubendris at HL7. And so Logica is continuing to run things, but we don't have internal support staff anymore that are actually fielding tickets. So yes, they will get routed to HL7.
Yes, and we recognize there's some issue right now with the Logica server, and we're trying to run that to ground right now. So we are trying to respond to them. All right, so try to follow and give you all some time to transition to your next call. If I could ask Wayne and Diego and Dave and Chuck too, if you could stay on just a couple minutes after everyone drops off, I'd appreciate it. But thank you all for coming today. We will send out an announcement through that listserv for our call next week and provide a recording of this call. And if you have any questions, again, send it to the PMO at hl7.org. And thank you again for your participation. We look forward to hearing more from you about how we can make this happen.